Welcome to Handmade History.
Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Alicia.
I'm Sonia.
And this week we're talking about knitting groups.
So this was another listener suggestion, and it comes from Annie. She suggested craft groups as a topic because she goes to one. So thank you, Annie.
Yes. So we decided to narrow it down because the history of all crafty groups goes back to the very beginning of crafting. So I decided to focus on American knitting groups in the 20th and 21st century. And today we're going to talk about two moments when they became super popular. Because again, people have also been in knitting groups for that entire time also. But two major times that knitting groups became really, really popular here in the U.S. were during World War I and in the early 2000s. And I thought this would be an interesting comparison because they are almost exactly 100 years apart. And on the surface, they seem like very different circumstances, and they were. But there are also some similarities between these two moments in time. Both are very connected to women's issues and feminism and to changing roles and expectations of women in America.
So let's get started with knitting groups during World War I. So this is a quote from All of a Kind Family Uptown by Sydney Taylor. "I wonder how long Mama will be at the Red Cross Knitting Club," Ella said. "I hope she gets here in time to eat with us." "I bet she's enjoying herself," said Charlotte. "Nobody can knit like Mama. So fast and with such even stitches. No wonder all the women on the block made her join. We've only been at war with Germany for a month, but the Red Cross will need lots more knitters because the boys will be called up for service any day now," added Ella. So World War I began in Europe on July 28, 1914, and the U.S. entered the war on April 6, 1917. And a lot of people wanted to help in any way that they could. According to the Center for Knit and Crochet, knitting was one of the first responses to the outbreak of the First World War in the U.S. and Europe.
Yes. And at this time, women did not have the vote nationally. The 19th Amendment was not passed until August 18th, 1920. There were many women's organizations already in existence that did different things: advocacy for women, like the National Women's Party, and activism for causes and charitable projects, like the Women's Christian Temperance Union, also known as the YWCA. There were also affinity groups, labor organizations for women, groups like the Black Women of Los Angeles, Catholic or Jewish women's groups in different cities and places. And these organizations also had a social aspect to them. And women needed a certain amount of capital and leisure time in order to be involved with these groups. But at this time, these groups had a really important representative role because the government worked with women by working with these groups.
When the war broke out, women wanted to act. However, there was a dispute between the two largest national organizations of women about how best to proceed, because women wanted to help their country and they also wanted to be full citizens of their country by being granted the vote. At this time, women could vote in some states and not others. So we had the vote in Wyoming, Utah, Colorado, Washington, California, Oregon, Arizona, Montana, North Dakota, New York, and Rhode Island. The Women's National Party, which was led by Alice Paul, wanted to picket the White House in order to embarrass the president, Woodrow Wilson. However, according to a paper about women's mobilization during World War I by Lynn Dumenil, the National American Women's Suffrage Association, NAWSA, wanted to demonstrate loyalty and usefulness during the war crisis as means of validating their claim to full citizenship and suffrage. And there were competing ideas to either make trouble or to be helpful and hope you get rewarded. So Alice Paul did end up picketing the White House, and women from the NAWSA convinced the federal government to create an organization called the Women's Council of National Defense, which President Wilson did in 1917. However, it was a purely advisory body. The goal of the women in the WCND was to coordinate female volunteers all over the U.S. Unfortunately, other bureaucratic organizations and the government largely prevented them from doing this, and they tied them up in red tape.
Yes, so this is interesting to think about. There were two major women's groups, and they really disagreed about how best to be good citizens because both groups wanted the vote, but they had this kind of difference in approach that you mentioned, Sonia. Like, should they, disrupt things, or should they make themselves be like paragons of womanhood and citizenship? So it's not like either one won. They both just pursued their own, each followed their own paths and made their own choices. But I thought that was really interesting to read about. The WCND did do some organizing, and in Los Angeles, they were extremely successful. So the local chairperson there was a woman named Mrs. J.T. Anderson, and she was in charge of 800 precincts across the city. And I thought this was an interesting case study because the city was so big and it was so well organized. So this is just an example of the kind of mobilization that women were doing. So in each precinct, there was a committee, and Mrs. Anderson also contacted 350 women's organizations to send representatives to a planning meeting. And these included representatives from the Catholic Women of Los Angeles, the Jewish Women of Los Angeles, a labor organization for women, and many, many other groups. However, no groups of women of color were included. So some of the women who were excluded included Black branches of the YWCA. There were 200 Black women who tried to create a branch of the YWCA in Los Angeles, but their application was rejected by the local white branch. There was a club for Black women called the Sojourner Truth Club, but they were not invited to the WCND meeting. So these meetings were all organized to mostly work on knitting, and the women's clubs that were included benefited from these war efforts because newspapers reported on their activities and the clubs gained prestige and interest, and those that were excluded missed out on this benefit.
So the Red Cross also played a huge role in organizing the efforts of knitters around the country. They created patterns and distributed the patterns and wool. And they also helped knitters learn to knit and how to make the garments. And then they collected the finished garments and distributed them to servicemen. So how did they do this? In 1917, the organization created the Women's Advisory Committee to advise the Women's Bureau and organize all women's activities, largely knitting and rolling bandages. The leader of the Women's Bureau was Florence Marshall, the principal of the Manhattan Trade School for Girls. She took a leave of absence to work for the Red Cross. She surveyed existing knitting patterns for the military from other relief organizations.
Yes, and she created a booklet called Instructions for Knitting, also known as ARC-400, and I found a copy of this booklet for sale online for $295. And this was the very first national knitting pattern booklet published by the Red Cross. And it was intended to be distributed around the country and used by anybody who was interested in helping out. So the instructions are very simple. The pattern doesn't have much or any shaping at all, and very little seaming or finishing. The patterns use basic techniques and stitches, and I thought I would share an example of the pattern for a vest. So this was published on August 11th, 1917. All you do to make this vest is cast on 80 stitches, knit 2, purl 2 stitches for 4 inches, knit plain until the sweater measures 25 inches, knit 28 stitches, bind off 24 stitches for neck, loose, knit 28 stitches, knit 7 ridges on each shoulder, cast on 24 stitches, knit plain for 21 inches, purl 2, knit 2 stitches for 4 inches, sew up the sides, leaving 9 inches for armholes, 2 rows single crochet around neck, and 1 row single crochet around the armholes. So you can see it's a very simple pattern. Basically, all you do is knit a big rectangle with a hole for the head and sew up the sides and leave an opening for the arms. This guide was also impressive in that it included standardized needle dimensions for each pattern, and there was actually a diagram of the needle size that you needed, and you could lay your knitting needle on it to check that it was the right one. Because at this time, needle sizes were not standardized.
According to research done by historian Rebecca Keel, the estimated value of Red Cross donations, which included hats, socks, sweaters, vests, and other knitted garments from 1914 to 1919, totaled $41,858,284.72. And that amounts to $763,623,154 in today's dollars.
Yes.
Yeah.
So very impressive. I found a great photo collection, which was actually a class project done by students at Catholic University called Knitting with a Purpose, 20th Century Wartime Knitting. And it had photos of groups of people knitting all around the country at this time. So a lot of them were Red Cross members or knitting Red Cross related. So I thought I would share some of these examples because they were very interesting. There was one photo that had young girls in New Orleans, maybe 8 or 9 years old, knitting together wearing Red Cross uniforms. There was another photo that was labeled Members of the Junior Red Cross, which showed a group of children in 1917 or 1918. And I thought these young girls could be Latina or Filipina, and I thought it was interesting because they were not white. There was also a great collection of photos from Madison Square in New York City, and they were called Mrs. Winston's Auxiliary of the American Red Cross. And one caption read, "Every day at noon in Madison Square, over 200 working women gather to knit socks, scarves, and helmets for the boys in the trenches and on the North Sea." And you could see these women working in Madison Square, and it's green and like a park. And there's a sign that says work days, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, weather permitting. Some women wore the Red Cross uniform, which for women included a wimple. And there was a table and a tent where some women gathered to knit. Many were just standing and knitting. Other photos showed big piles of wool being distributed by the Red Cross. And one showed a table piled very high with sweaters that had been knitted by students, which Red Cross workers were sorting to ship to servicemen. And then there were also 2 posters in the collection. One had the caption, "Our boys need socks, SOX, knit your bit," with a basket full of yarn. Another said, "You can help." And it just had a picture of a woman knitting. So I thought these were really interesting snapshots, literal snapshots of what people around the country were doing to knit, what women around the country and girls were doing to knit during this time.
Yeah, that's like a huge variety.
It was a huge variety. And I also liked the 200 working women meeting to knit. A lot of them were wearing like heels, low heels
Yeah.
and, old fashioned dresses, and they were knitting on their lunch breaks.
Wow. It's a lot of people to get together, too.
A lot, yes.
So, to sum up, knitting was a way for women to get involved in World War I and support their families, friends, and their nation. It was an amazing organizational effort on many fronts. And I think it did show the power of women to accomplish things. There's concrete evidence in the form of knitted garments. It was not intersectional in terms of race, and women's clubs' involvement or lack thereof in the war effort may have actually widened the gap between white women and women of color. To address the issue of suffrage, I don't think we can say that women knitting directly got us the vote, but women working together in groups is what got us the vote, and women worked together in groups to knit a lot during this time.
Yes. So even though these groups, like the photos I saw, they weren't overtly political, I think women getting together to knit was political and remains political.
Mm-hmm.
So let's fast forward 100 years to another big knitting craze in the early 2000s. So from 1998 to 2003, the number of knitters under 35 doubled. And this is around when I started knitting. I learned how to knit in college with a group called the Knitwits around 2004 or so. And then 6 years later, maybe a little bit more, I went to a stitch and pitch night at a Mariners baseball game in Seattle. So a Major League Baseball game. And it was awesome. Everyone brought their knitting to the game. I got a special edition moose knitting bobblehead. He has yarn tangled in his antlers. And there were tons of people knitting there. So in those years, knitting groups had become really popular. And you can see it was even at Major League Baseball games. So as I was doing research about this time period, a phrase kept coming up in articles that I read that the new knitting groups that were springing up around the country were, quote, not your grandma's knitting groups. And this was definitely meant in kind of a flippantly derogatory way, as in your grandma is very boring and out of touch and her knitting group is so silly, but these knitting groups are really cool. And we would never say that. And I think that people now kind of avoid saying that. I think it's a spent phrase. People don't use it very much. But it was an interesting thing to see repeated because I think when writers are using it, they're just trying to say something new is happening in this craft and it's no longer out of date. But it also expresses a divide between the generations. And I found some interesting quotes from women at this time who joined these new knitting groups. So in a Newsweek article from 2004, one woman said, "The only knitting group I could find before was called the Windy City Knitting Guild, and they meet in the library. I'm sure they're great women, but they weren't really the people I wanted to hang out with." And the woman who said this, her name was Brandon Janish, and she was a web designer from Chicago's North Side. Another quote from a woman named Faith Landsman, who went to a Stitch and Bitch group in LA. She said, "I don't want to sit around with my grandma. I wanted to sit around with women my own age, people I have something in common with." So even though the phrase is not like very nice, I think it did show something that people who were young adults at this time, something that they wanted, which was maybe connection to other people in their peer group via.
So how did this craze begin? Two strands definitely interconnected. Debbie Stoller started a nationwide network of groups called Stitch and Bitch, and then the internet happened. So Debbie Stoller grew up in Brooklyn, New York, and earned her PhD in women's psychology at Yale. She worked at Nickelodeon, which is where she met Marcel Karp, and together they founded Bust magazine, which is still around today. So they ran off their first 500 copies in Nickelodeon's offices in 1993 and went full-time creating the magazine in 2001. And circulation went from 1,000 to 100,000 in 8 years, according to Stoller. The Bust was a magazine made for women. And Stoller said, quote, "It's going to be about you first and the rest of the world laid out for you like a banquet." And it included knitting, unlike other women's magazines at the time, including magazines like Glamour, Vogue, and Ms.
Yes, so it was unique in that way. And Stoller also started Stitch and Bitch groups. So the first recorded Stitch and Bitch group was actually a club started in Akron, Ohio by 12 women who met during World War II to knit. So wanted to share this little story, which I found in a great book called No Idle Hands. These women had all moved back in with their parents because their husbands were at war and they met weekly. And all but one of the husbands came back and they disbanded the group after the war. But the group was called Stitch and Bitch. We didn't talk much about World War II on here, but there was a lot of knitting then as well. The first modern Stitch and Bitch was held in 1999 at the Java and Jazz Cafe in New York. It's then branched out into Chicago and LA. And in 2003, the LA Stitch and Bitch had over 150 women as members. About 20 met regularly at the Unurban Coffee House. So it grew pretty quickly. The Guardian called Stoller a pioneer for knitting on feminist grounds. And feminism at this time was often called third wave feminism. So very simplistically, the first wave was suffragettes and women wanting to vote. So the Red Cross knitting for World War I, that was during the first wave of feminism. The second wave took place in the 70s, and it was all about women not being locked into gender roles and being able to work and be treated the same as men outside the home, being able to do things like open a bank account in your own name and have more power outside of the home. And then the third wave, which was happening in the early 2000s, late 90s, was reclaiming traditionally feminine activities if you want to, because they are fun. So that's a very glib way of putting it. But it was kind of more about emphasizing that the choices that women have include doing these like crafts that in the 70s were kind of maybe frowned upon by some people. And at this time, another thing that was kind of popular was new domesticity. So I was remembering Nigella Lawson, who had a cooking show, and she actually published a cookbook, which I thought had a very apt title. It was called How to Be a Domestic Goddess, and that was in 2000.
Okay, so there's a lot of great quotes from Debbie Stoller about feminism and knitting. She said, "Some women find work a grind because that's exactly what it is." In the 70s, she said, quote, "Any fulfillment you're going to get as a woman will be to do with the job that you have." And she pushed back on this idea. She said, "Clearly, all these things that women were barred from doing became very important for women to get into doing. She added, but that doesn't mean that the things they always did were in and of themselves oppressive and bad. So in an interview with The Guardian in 2005, she said, people are always trying to raise it, meaning knitting, to something else. So you're saying it's really an art form? No. Is soccer really an art form? You don't have to validate that in the same way. No, it's not an art form. It's a craft. It's very pleasurable. It's satisfying. It's a great way to spend your time. Oh, so you're saying that it's a way to reduce stress in September 11th and that's why people are doing it again? No, it's just a fun thing. Our grandmothers have always known this and we're trying to learn and we're just learning it again. So, quote, it's a very feminist thing to try to keep these crafts alive that women spent so many hundreds of years engaged in. And that was from an LA Times article.
Yes. So I picked these quotes because I thought they were just such incisive takes on knitting and kind of reflect what people were saying to her, and also kind of these like new ideas at the time. Like, you don't have to elevate knitting to an art form in order to be a fan of it or participate in it. You don't have to dislike everything that your grandmother did just because you dislike the rules about the time that she grew up in. She had just so many interesting things to say about knitting. These are only a few of the things that I found. Stoller also wrote 5 Stitch and Bitch books, starting with Stitch and Bitch, The Knitter's Handbook, which was published in 2003. And they were all very popular, and I have at least one. Do you have any of them, Sonia?
I don't think so.
I had one called Son of Stitch and Bitch. I think I might have given it away, but it was great. And then I have definitely read the one about crochet, which I believe is called The Happy Hooker. So they're great books. They're really fun. And they're full. The first one, The Knitter's Handbook, has kind of like punk knitting patterns. Like there's a hat with an umbilical cord on it for a baby that you can knit. Yeah. So the second thread that really made knitting explode around the US at this time was the internet. So the internet was very young at this time, and the knitting community was a unique mix of online and real life activity. And not only in knitting, but for other activities or in other like areas of life. People could both meet online and then meet in real life, or they could meet in real life and then meet online. And there were 2 really crucial websites that helped knitting. One was meetup.com, which was started in 2002 and was a site where people could organize real life meetups, and you could just show up. And I definitely went to knitting meetups in pretty much every city that I moved to, because you could just go on the website, type in your zip code, and it would show you all the different groups that were around. Did you ever go to a meetup, Sonia?
Yeah, that's how I found a knitting group.
Nice.
Where I live now, where it was all through Meetup.
Oh, nice.
People still use it.
Yeah. Another site that was really important to the knitting community online was Ravelry. Ravelry was started in 2007, and it's a knitting and crocheting platform, and other fiber arts too, that includes patterns and also forums. And my first knitting group that I went to had a forum on Ravelry where they would chat kind of in between meetings. And now also a lot of shops or pattern makers or groups have just other groups have forums on Ravelry where people can chat.
Blogs are also social hubs. The internet was a lot smaller than it is now. So, for example, Yarn Harlot is a big blog, and in our very first blog post, her actual friends commented. You can still read it online now, and we'll link it in the show notes. So knitting was hugely popular online. The Yarn Harlot's blog was awarded the best blog in Canada in the Canadian Blog Awards in 2008, and it became incredibly easy to find a knitting group. It also cut down on the awkwardness of showing up uninvited or needing to be invited, and it could be organized by knitters who didn't live near a knitting shop where knitting groups often take place.
Yes. So the internet really helped us out.
Yeah. I mean, the ones on Meetup too also kind of help you find your level of knitting group as well. There's just so much.
Mm.
So the one I met was very casual, or they met at breweries. So
yeah. Oh, fun.
Yeah. So it wasn't because sometimes they can be really intense.
Yeah. So obviously there were some big differences between knitting in the early 1900s in the U.S. and knitting in the early 2000s in the U.S. During World War I, the knitting that groups of people were doing had stakes. The knitters were helping men who were fighting in war and, providing this kind of tangible link to their loved ones who were far away. This is a huge difference to knitters meeting up in the 90s and early 2000s. The knitters of World War I were also highly organized by the Red Cross and other women's groups, and it was a seriously impressive collective effort, and these many diverse groups were really closely connected at this time. But in the late 90s, early 2000s, the network of Stitch and Bitch groups was actually very large. I found numbers from 800 to 1,000 different groups. And like you said, Sonia, you can kind of find one wherever you want, even multiple ones wherever you want now. And other similarities were that these were generally groups of women getting together to knit, and it allowed people to talk and help one another and organize. So the women who were knitting for World War I could have been across many generations and races and, cultures. But the thing that they had in common at this time was World War I. Other things they had in common was a lot of them were fighting for the vote. And in the 90s and 2000s, there were all those lines about women who wanted to meet with one another because they were, much less dire, but they were also discussing a new, maybe, form of feminism or just their own personal situations, which were, on some level, political. So there's a political thread or undercurrent in both time periods. In World War I, women were working to get the vote. And later on in the early 2000s, women were working to reclaim traditional women's activities, or maybe more broadly, to come to a better balance or understanding of their options as women in the modern world.
Mm.
What do you think, Sonia?
Yeah, I think community is always political in some way, especially when the other side of that is women belong in the home. And then so any level of getting out and into the world in another community is resistant to that idea. And I think even now there's so much talk about finding third spaces again, real life community. Because I think there's just something that people need in that too. So
definitely.
I also didn't realize the knitting groups were so highly organized. I guess I thought of them more as local organization or local organizing efforts, during both world wars, right? Just kind of people kind of doing their part, but to realize it was such a massive nationwide process is pretty interesting.
Yes, and I think especially for World War I, the women were so organized because their garments were really needed.
Yeah.
The army genuinely needed the socks and vests and things like that.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was really interesting to read how organized they were.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for listening. If you have a knitting group you'd like to share with us, we would love to read about it. You can email us at handmadehistoryhosts, that's HOSTS @gmail.com. You can also find us on Tumblr, Blue Sky, and Instagram. Just search up Handmade History Podcast on all of those, except for Blue Sky, where we're Handmade History Pod.
Email us your favorite knitting blogs.
Email us your favorite knitting blogs. That's a great idea. Yes, we would love to read your favorite knitting blogs.
Do you have any of the Stitch and Bitch books? Let us know.
Yes, do that. Thanks for listening.
Thanks.
Bye.
It's like pounds of lace all over again, Alicia.